Night settles over the delta like a held breath, thick, unmoving, waiting. Two lanterns flicker outside an abandoned brick kitchen, their light trembling across scorched earth that still seems to remember what happened there. And at the center of it all stands one man, a quiet cook, a shadow in his master's house, hands steady, heart hollow, eyes fixed on the cauldrons he's tended his entire life. Tonight, those cauldrons aren't meant for food, they're meant for justice. You can almost smell the heat rising, the slow building roar of fire swallowing dry wood, the kind of heat that turns iron cruel and air metallic. And as the first spark leaps, you feel it too, the moment a man stops being a servant and becomes something else entirely. Because when a world built on domination crushes a man's family and demands he return to work the next morning, something ancient wakes up. Something cold, something patient, and tonight, it's coming for the men who thought they owned him. A reckoning is about to begin. Before we dive into this cinematic descent into vengeance, power, and impossible choices, take a second, hit subscribe, tap the bell, and drop a like so more people can experience stories told with this level of depth and craft. It genuinely helps the channel grow. Alright, settle in. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a haunting reminder of what happens when a man who's lost everything finally stops holding back. The night the Delta held its breath began with one man stepping into darkness, his boots pressing damp soil that remembered every secret buried beneath it, carrying a quiet tension that curled around him like smoke. He moved past shuttered cabins where only the soft breaths of working men slept, each unaware that the air tonight felt heavier, colder, almost aware of its own gathering anticipation. A single lantern swayed above the old brick kitchen, its glow trembling across cracked stones as if warning him that nothing born here ever left untouched by the weight of memory. Inside the kitchen, iron pots hung like silent jurors, each reflecting the faint shimmer of firelight and the slow calm in his chest, born not of peace but of acceptance. You could almost smell the coming storm on him, not a storm of rain but a storm of choice, the sort that changes a man from servant to something far colder. 2 short breaths escaped him before one long exhale drifted toward the rafters, dissolving into the brittle quiet that clung to the walls with ghost-like patience. He wasn't young, but something in his shoulders still held the steel of a man who'd risen every dawn to shape fire and iron into tools stronger than any command. Tonight, though, his strength felt different, carved not from duty but from a slow-burning truth finally stepping forward after years of silence. A gust of winter wind slipped through a gap in the window, brushing against his neck like a reminder that time was shifting beneath his feet. He turned toward the cauldrons he'd tended for years, each resting still and cold, their broad iron lips waiting for purpose as though sensing what his hands intended. For a moment he closed his eyes, feeling the memory of every meal crafted here, each one shaped for men who believed obedience was carved into his bones. But bones remember pain, and his remembered everything: the weight of orders, the sting of punishment, the hollow ache left by a world where a man served until he had nothing left. He opened his eyes again, sharper now, seeing this room not as a place of labor but as a forge where something final would be hammered into existence. A whisper of fire flickered beneath the hearthstones, his fingers steady as they coaxed the first sparks into life, each spark reflecting a decision already made. As the flames grew, shadows rippled along the brick walls, stretching like restless spirits that had waited too long for someone to give them voice. He moved with controlled precision, 2 short motions followed by a long one, the rhythm of a man who understood that power always begins with intention. Behind him, the wine pressed against the door, pushing it open just an inch, as though the night itself wanted to witness what he was becoming. He glanced back but didn't close it, letting the cold air mingle with rising heat, creating a strange tension that pulsed against his jaw. His breath deepened as he approached the storage shelves, retrieving bundles he'd hidden among spices, each wrapped carefully so no wandering eye could read their meaning. He set them beside the hearth and knelt, feeling the warmth building steadily, like a heartbeat waking beneath iron and wood. Every movement he made was deliberate, shaped by patience earned over years of swallowing words he longed to speak but dared not release. The flames crackled louder now, hungry, eager, glowing against his skin as if urging him to continue before the world outside remembered how to breathe again. He fed the fire with seasoned wood, each log settling into place with the certainty of a man stacking the final stones of a doorway he could never return through. The air thickened, shimmering with heat, carrying a scent both familiar and unsettling, the scent of oil waiting for purpose it had never been meant to serve. He paused only once, pressing a hand to the scar across his wrist, the one given years ago as a lesson he'd never forget. It throbbed faintly now, as though the past itself pulsed beneath his fingertips, urging him not to hesitate, not tonight. He stood again, shoulders squared, breath steadying as he returned to the cauldrons with a resolve that felt older than the walls around him. Even the floorboards seemed to sense the shift, their creaking softened, as if they feared breaking the moment forming in the heat. In the rising glow, his shadow stretched long and tall behind him, no longer the silhouette of a servant, but of a man stepping into something far more relentless. And as the fire roared higher, licking the black iron with hungry red tongues, he whispered to the empty room, knowing the night had finally chosen its reckoning. The morning after everything shattered began with a silence so heavy it felt alive, pressing against his ribs as he woke alone in a cabin that no longer held the warmth of familiar breathing. He sat upright slowly, the rough mattress creaking beneath him, every sound feeling amplified as though the world wanted him to hear how empty it had become without the men he loved. A beam of pale sun cut across the room, catching dust in midair, each drifting particle strange and foreign now that his purpose had been broken into pieces beyond repair. He rubbed his eyes with trembling fingers, feeling the grit of sleepless hours spent replaying the moment everything changed, each memory sharp enough to draw blood from the inside. Outside, boots thudded on hard dirt as overseers barked commands, the usual rhythm of plantation life continuing untouched, indifferent to the grief knotted inside his chest. He stepped out into the cold dawn, breath drifting like smoke, watching it disappear as though reminding him how easily a man's entire world can vanish without warning. His hands curled unconsciously into fists, callous palms remembering the grip of his son's shoulder, the warmth of his brother's laughter, the final moment when hope slipped out of reach. He began walking toward the fields, each step heavy, each footprint sinking deeper than it should have, as if the earth itself mourned alongside him in quiet solidarity. Men around him nodded respectfully, their eyes lowering, sensing a storm inside him that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with loss. No one spoke to him. They knew silence was the only language grief could tolerate, especially when grief turned a strong man into something colder. The cotton rows stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering with morning frost, each row a reminder of the life he once believed he could protect by working hard and staying unseen. As he bent to pick the first cotton boll, his fingers paused, trembling at the memory of teaching his son to do the same, both pretending the future would be kind. He straightened suddenly, air catching in his throat as anger flickered sharp and hot beneath the grief like a coal refusing to die under ash. 2 short breaths escaped him before a long exhale slid out, carrying a piece of his old self away, swept into the cold wind that scoured the fields. He turned his head toward the big house, jaw tightening, seeing the windows glint with morning light, unaware they were reflecting back the birth of something dangerous in him. Every surface of that house held memories he didn't want. Commands barked, punishments delivered, men lost, promises broken, yet now those memories stitched themselves together into a single purpose. A raven perched on the nearest fence post, its black feathers absorbing the sun instead of reflecting it, watching him with a stillness that felt almost knowing. He met its gaze, feeling a strange calm settle over him, the kind that comes not from peace but from accepting that a man pushed too far cannot return unchanged. He resumed working, movements controlled and steady, each pull of cotton measured like a ritual meant to keep his rage from spilling over too soon. But inside his chest, the storm gathered strength, each heartbeat heavier, echoing with the final words spoken by the man he'd loved more than anyone alive. By midday the sun blazed overhead, turning the frost to mud and sweat, yet the heat couldn't reach the coldness that had settled deep inside his bones. He wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, scanning the yard where overseers strutted like self-appointed gods, unaware that the ground beneath them was shifting. One overseer paused near him, opening his mouth to issue another command, but something in the man's eyes faltered when he studied the quiet fire brewing behind his stare. The overseer stepped back, creating distance without fully understanding why, sensing only that pushing this man today might awaken something even he couldn't control. He continued through the afternoon with a focus far sharper than the field demanded, each motion deliberate, each breath deep, his thoughts working like gears turning toward inevitability. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky in dying reds, his decision felt carved into him, not spoken aloud but etched deeper than spoken vows. He walked back to the cabin slowly, boots dragging through dust, every step sounding like a countdown toward a moment no man could undo. Inside, he sat on the edge of his bed, elbows resting on his knees, staring at his hands as though seeing them for the first time in his life. These were hands that built, healed, protected, but now they trembled with the weight of what they would soon be willing to do in the name of justice. He leaned forward, breath shaking not from weakness but from the terrifying clarity that grief had fused with purpose until they became indistinguishable. And in that dim cabin, with shadows stretching long across the floor, he realized a truth that chilled him deeper than any winter wind. A good man had broken, and something far more relentless had risen in his place. The sun slipped behind the tree line as he entered the storage shed, its fading light catching dust motes that drifted like tiny ghosts around the tools he'd spent years arranging with obsessive precision. He moved slowly between shelves, fingertips brushing metal edges, each touch stirring memories of long nights forging tools for men who never saw him as anything more than labor shaped into flesh. Tonight his steps held a different weight, each one marking a boundary crossed within him, an invisible line separating the man he once was from the one necessity demanded he become. He knelt beside a crate at the back wall, lifting the lid to reveal bundles of dried herbs he'd gathered discreetly over months, each chosen for a purpose hidden beneath their innocent scents. As he unwrapped them, the bitter aroma filled the shed, sharp enough to sting his eyes, yet strangely comforting in its promise to give him the control he'd been denied. 2 short breaths steadied his hands before he ground the leaves, each slow rotation of the pestle sounding like distant marching, the rhythm tightening the air around him. He mixed powders with practiced care, calculating proportions based on countless quiet experiments conducted while the plantation slept, each test shaping the weapon he needed. His jaw clenched at the memory of nights kneeling on cold floorboards, checking the pulse of small animals to measure the potency of mixtures he'd sworn would never be used lightly. But light choices died the day his world was ripped apart, replaced by a singular duty that burned hotter than any forge he'd ever worked beneath. He poured the combined powder into 4 small vials, labeling them with carved markings only he could interpret, the simple symbols carrying the weight of final judgment. Standing again, he scanned the shed, ensuring no trace of his work remained, each surface returned to its orderly appearance so overseers would see nothing but obedient consistency. He stepped outside into the cooling air, inhaling deeply as dusk settled across the yard, coating everything with a dim softness that belied the simmering tension beneath. Men trudged toward their cabins in tired silence, unaware of the plan taking shape in the shadows beside them, unaware of the storm forming behind his calm expression. He nodded to a few as they passed, their weary eyes meeting his briefly, sensing something shifting yet knowing better than to ask when answers could bring danger. Crossing the yard, he approached the kitchen building, its silhouette rising against the fading sky like a monument to countless meals prepared under command rather than choice. Inside, he lit a small lamp and set the vials on a wooden table, arranging them carefully beside jars of spices he often used to mask stronger tastes. The ginger root caught his eye, its sharp scent drifting upward, reminding him of winter nights when he baked sweet bread to brighten spirits in the quarters. Now that same sweetness would conceal bitterness, transforming comfort into consequence, a poetic symmetry too fitting to ignore in the careful calculus of retribution. He measured flour and molasses into a bowl, mixing slowly, each turn of the spoon shaping dough that carried a purpose far beyond nourishment or celebration. As the batter thickened beneath his hands, his breath steadied, the once shaking grief replaced by eerie calm, the kind that comes when destiny feels predetermined. He folded the powder into the mixture, blending it with long, deliberate strokes, ensuring no hint of its presence remained detectable by sight or scent alone. In that moment, he felt the weight of his actions settle across his shoulders like a cloak, heavy yet fitting, a garment woven from pain, memory, and determination. He poured the batter into 4 separate pans, marking each discreetly with a notch carved into the edge, silent indicators of destinies already sealed. Sliding them into the oven, he leaned on the counter, eyes drifting shut, listening to the crackling fire as if hearing whispered encouragement rising from the flames. It was in these quiet seconds, surrounded by heat and shadows, that he felt closest to the men he had lost, their presence settling behind him like steadying hands. The oven's heat warmed his skin, and in that warmth he found strength, the kind forged by loss but tempered by purpose, solidifying into something uncheckable. When the timer's soft click broke the silence, He opened the oven and inhaled the rich scent of gingerbread, the sweetness almost mocking in its familiarity. He set the pans on the cooling rack, watching steam curl upward like spirits ascending, each wisp carrying the echo of a vow he intended to keep. Night pressed firmly against the windows now, the world outside blanketed in a darkness that felt ready to hide whatever the coming hours demanded. He turned down the lamps, letting the room settle into comfortable dimness, every shadow aligning with his resolve as he whispered to the empty space a single truth. No force on earth could stop him now, because once a man accepts that justice will never come unless he takes it himself, there is nothing left to fear in the dark. The last hours before everything unfolded began with a sky so clear it felt unnatural, the stars sharp and cold above him as he walked toward the kitchen with a steadiness that bordered on eerie. His boots pressed silently through frost-coated grass, each step forming a pale imprint that vanished behind him, as though the night itself refused to leave evidence of the path he'd chosen. In his chest, a quiet rhythm beat, not frantic, not hesitant, but measured, like a drum guiding soldiers toward a battle they'd already accepted long before dawn. When he reached the kitchen door, he paused only long enough to feel the grain of the wood beneath his fingers, letting its familiar texture ground him for one last moment. Then he pushed inside, welcomed by the glow of embers he'd left smoldering hours earlier, their soft warmth rising like a heartbeat waiting to surge back to life. He added fresh logs to the hearth, flames leaping upward with sudden hunger, casting shifting patterns across the walls that made the room feel alive and watching. 2 short breaths left him as he knelt beside the cauldrons, touching their cold iron rims, imagining the heat they would soon hold, the transformation waiting within their heavy depths. He stood and retrieved the marked gingerbread pans, sliding each onto a tray, his movements deliberate, the weight of purpose tightening his shoulders with controlled intensity. Outside, the walkway creaked as men approached, their drunken laughter drifting through the night. Unaware they stepped toward the final chapter of a story they had written themselves. He positioned the tray on the counter just as the door swung open, for men entering with confidence only possible for those who believe consequence is meant for others. They settled into chairs, speaking loudly, slurring their words, the sweet burn of alcohol heavy on their breath as they boasted about control they assumed nothing could touch. He kept his back turned, expression calm, letting their voices wash over him like distant noise, no longer capable of stirring fear or hesitation within him. As he sliced the gingerbread, the knife moved steadily, reflecting firelight in thin flashes that danced across the blade like fleeting omens guiding his hand. He served them with practiced grace, each plate delivered with a quiet bow, his eyes never revealing the storm concealed behind their dark composure. While they ate, he checked the fires beneath the cauldrons, adjusting logs with slow precision, making sure the flames rose exactly as his plan required. Heat began to climb through the iron, radiating outward in waves that shimmered in the air, blurring the lines between shadow and flame with unsteady motion. Within minutes, the men's voices grew softer, then strained, confusion creeping into their tones as muscles stiffened and limbs grew heavier than they understood. One tried to stand, wobbling before collapsing back into his chair, breath thinning as paralysis settled, slowly consuming what little control he believed he still possessed. Another attempted to shout, but the sound broke apart halfway, fading into a strangled whisper that vanished beneath the crackle of rising fire. He turned toward them now, eyes cold but steady, watching realization dawn upon their faces as their bodies betrayed them, trapped between awareness and immobility. The room narrowed into a single shared heartbeat, each man frozen in fear while he stepped closer, his footsteps soft but carrying the weight of finality. He whispered nothing, offered no speeches, no monologues of revenge, only silence, the kind that pierces deeper than words and reveals intention without apology. With practiced motions, he dragged the first man toward the cauldron, muscles tensing beneath the strain, breath steady, expression carved from stone. The heat roared upward as he prepared the pulley, its wooden groan echoing through the kitchen like a final warning the night refused to deliver. He secured the ropes with calm determination, lifting the man slowly, inch by inch, giving him time to understand the truth he had long believed impossible. As the man dangled above the bubbling surface, the firelight reflected in his terrified eyes, mirroring the same cold certainty forged inside the cook's soul. The cauldron hissed when he lowered the body, steam rising in thick clouds that swallowed the man's form as silent agony twisted across his frozen features. Another man followed, then another, each lowered with the same deliberate pace, each swallowed by the same merciless heat that had once taken everything from him. By the time he reached the last, his breath trembled not with doubt but with the raw exhaustion of a man fulfilling a promise carved into bone. He lowered the final body with care, watching the flames dance brighter, as though recognizing completion, the night settling into a heavy, reverent stillness. When all was done, he wiped his hands on a cloth, sank onto a stool near the door, and finally allowed a single breath to escape, a breath filled not with triumph but with the quiet gravity of a man who had finished the only story left for him to write.